Edward Unthank here. We're going to be talking today about lead scoring and how this actually works within your marketing operations, organization, and system infrastructure. Some things, quick note, if you are trying to transcribe anything, we have all of our resources that we reference throughout this slide in this deck. We have all of those actually down here in the summary comments. So just go to that link and check it all out. You don't have to worry about transcribing everything that I say. Okay, so agenda, what we're looking at today. First, we want to tackle philosophically what is lead scoring and the kind of different components to it. The next stage, we're getting into the actual maturity distribution and areas where you can determine where your company is right now and where you need to move into the future in order to improve the quality of your lead scoring. And then, finally, and hopefully the majority of this is going to be more about the in-the-depth, actual practical tips on how you can do it. Just try to extract as much value as possible from this and keep it nitty-gritty helpful. So with that, let's jump in. So, scoring. I want to talk about scoring generally, what scoring is, because I think scoring is one of the most interesting pieces and most promising pieces of marketing today that we're kind of overlooking. Generally, B2B marketing is overlooking. Scoring, everyone knows what scoring is generally. The very beginning piece, we have an overall record, we have a lead, and we need to do things like stack and prioritize all of the leads in the database for things like sales advantage and things like scoring thresholds in the case of marking somebody as marketing qualified lead throughout the process. But scoring really philosophically and fundamentally, I think, is important to cover off on. And the formula that I'm showing here on screen is exactly what we're talking about. So from a pure basis, we talk about econometrics, an idea of we have a score and it represents whatever we want it to. And then we have the other inputs which actually drive the numerical score itself. There's a really important piece of this that I think is interesting, and that is that you can do this for anything, right? We have lead scoring, and popularly people think of lead scoring just as behavior score and demographic score and lead score and fit score. But in reality, we have the ability to reinvent any kind of proxy, a number representing a proxy for targeting solutions or anything else that can actually be used within marketing technology to make marketing smarter. So this is kind of the on-screen I have. This is a linear, or rather multilinear regression math here. The most important part isn't really just this piece. You don't have to go into depth on any of this, but fundamentally and from a data science perspective, this is really, I think, what we try to get to and what people kind of forget about as the actual mathematical origins of scoring. Going into the next slide here, you can really see what we're talking about because we have behavior score here. And behavior score is a really easy example. Basically, what we think is a behavior score generally is kind of a measure of how much a person interacts with your properties. That's one philosophical approach to it. Another one, and the one that I think of, is saying that behavior score is the higher the behavior score, the more likely a prospect is to have a positive conversation with your sales team. And you can see on the screen here, this is really common. I'm going to show you actually in Marketo what this looks like. But this is really the core fundamentals. We think about what really means, what are the inputs to somebody having a positive conversation with sales? What is our hypothesis? What are our theory of the important elements that relate to that being greater? If you incrementally increase, for example, the amount of high-value web page visits, that's significant behavior score, because that shows, if you're going to the Contact Us page, to trial pages, to pricing, to case studies, as well as to deeper content marketing, such as, team calculators and other things like this, really we find that those are significantly important with a likelihood to have a positive conversation with sales. And I'm going to use behavior score specifically to pick on it and to give you an example throughout the multiple different stages. So the maturity stages that we see within lead scoring is basically the maturity and I find it very aligned to the data-driven nature of the marketing organization, the emphasis on data culture within an organization. The first one is what everyone knows about, and that's lead scoring. That's commonly where we increase behavior score as well as demographic score. It's primarily, if not entirely, within marketing automation is where we're getting all of these signals. It's possible and it's common that we get data enrichment in order to get more sources of this information. But generally we start with, I like to call it finger in the wind. It's directional math. If this number increases, our theory is that it will be more likely, somebody will be more interested in us, or we will be more interested in them as a company. The second stage of maturity is a little bit better than that, which is to say we get from directional math, which is, I would say, even pseudo-mathy, into predictive tools. This is also enormously common. We see this a lot. This is where we say, instead of behavior score and demographic score, really more common in this predictive tools industry in a stage 2, is more of fit score, intent score, and lookalike scores. Those are kind of the driving tools. But predictive tools is to say that a company is investing in predictive analytics tools for their company themselves, and that tool is doing all the intelligent math and ordering and just feeding the answers into your marketing automation system. That's the second stage. I'm not going to go into crazy detail about that because it's a pretty saturated market and there's a lot of research that people can do for it. But the third stage is really, in my mind, the most interesting and the greatest area of opportunity in terms of competitive advantage and in terms of getting marketing to be more science-driven. And that is when you have a data science team or person who actually owns and drives these scores. And this is ginormously valuable. What we're finding is that some of the biggest clients that we work with, the most advanced clients that we work with, have an actual data science team that is working with marketing in order to drive the usage and intelligence of all of these individual scores so that we can have not just fit score, intent score, but we can have other things that can be closed loop smarter over time, such as estimate of lifetime value for prospects. There are some technologies, and it depends, and really I think what matters is stage 3 is when companies are large and complex enough to realize some of the important pieces that drive some of the intelligence of their scoring, the actual proxies. So for example, if you're a SaaS company and you sell seats is your pricing model, the amount of seats in an organization such as a marketing organization, you can very quickly, without having a prospect interact with you nearly at all, be able to use intelligent technology scraping to do employee counts multiplied by the pricing model, multiplied by the expected value and the amount of renewals to come up with actual math that becomes better over time to estimate actual lifetime value. Other things you can do is contract value, profiling scores. There are a lot of things that you can do, but basically this stage is to say that we have a data science resource who is helping to drive a lot of this intelligence so that it's not just a database with marketing theory behind it, but also that we have a database with theory driven by a recurring model of numbers that can get smarter over time. And this is really, I think, where we'll spend quite a bit more time here. But for the moment, I'm going to jump into, and I think it makes sense, we can start with going deep into stage 1, directional math, the common behavior scores, demographic scores, and from there we can determine what the next steps are. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide here. And now it's time to talk a little bit more about stage 1, which is directional math in scoring. And this is important because we have what I call finger in the wind scoring. It's, where is, based on this person, what is their interest? What direction are we expecting? The point is that it's really intuitive, but is not data driven. And that's really the core stage. Mathematically, when we think about finger in the wind stage 1, we think generally, at least in Marketo, that scoring is an additive measure, which means that the actual math behind it is pure add or subtract individual weighted values based on activity. In reality, from a data science view, this approach to scoring is laughably inaccurate. And that's important to know because really when you get up to the larger maturity companies, you need to start having that mathematical integrity into the way that you're doing marketing itself. But I think stage 1 is an excellent place to be. It's an excellent place. It has a lot of value. Major benefits that we see from the stack ranking value in Salesforce or your CRM, massively important. If you can have a lead score field summed up and then sorted descending so that your sales reps will only see the people who are, one, most likely to actually have a positive conversation with you, and two, demographically qualified, meaning that that we are focused on whoever is going to bring us the largest business value first. Usually we sort that based on lifetime value, estimates of lifetime value, of which the common analogy within marketing and marketing operations is to say that that's demographic score. So it's fast and dirty, way better than nothing. It's directional, and that is better than not having anything at all. The cons are kind of exactly what I listed. It's kind of laughably inaccurate from a mathematical perspective, and that can be so bad that it occasionally leads to problems with sales not finding the value in it. That case, it's so quick and dirty that it's not even valuable and not going to provide sustainable value. But what we need to think about is really with each of these scores, what does that score actually mean? And with additive math such as this, in finger in the wind, stage 1, it's all based on additive and it's all by that directional. So that's stage 1, and now let's get a little bit more into kind of an overview on stage 2 here. So stage 2, we're talking about stage 2 in lead scoring now, predictive analytics vendor. This is, and it has been kind of all of the rage recently in the last few years, specifically about 2 or 3 years ago, predictive vendors were exploding in the market. And this is based on a model, which is to say the math. If we look at the math model, the core philosophy behind this stage is that scores are practically, and not exactly, but infinitely multifactorial with more complex math, not additive math. And the idea is that predictive vendors like to scrape up as many data points as possible, put them into their own database, and then run their own math off of that. Most of the time, this is black box. It's not always black box. It's really depends on who you're talking with, and there's a lot of valuation within the market here. But stage 1 into 2, if you're going from directional to predictive, if you have enough opportunities per year, which I think you should be looking at something like the minimum 100 opportunities at all, but reality, we're trying to get 100 closed won at the very minimum of respectable math in order to get closed won opportunity information into these people. If you have enough data, this is just mathematically and business intelligence better than stage 1. It will, if you have your team, your sales team actually running off of the scores in Salesforce or your CRM, sorted descending, all that we're looking at from the stage 1, which is directional math, into predictive, is incredibly better math. So if you have enough data, this is massively, massively valuable. Some of the cons about this generally is because you're working with a predictive vendor, that means that you're sharing resources with every other customer that they have. And what that means is that you generally get kind of slow speed to changes, and it's pretty baked in that you work primarily off of a fit and an intent score. And then if you try to create your own scores, you might have a little bit more complexity with that. I'm sure that there are tools that do it, but that's based on another conversation. So stage 2 predictive analytics vendors, entirely helpful, but the next stage above that, stage 3, let's progress to the next slide here. The third stage is data science run, which is to say that stage 2 is basically to say we need really complex math systems, of which I entirely agree, because scores need to actually correlate to real world values, and not just hypothetical values and philosophical high level values, but really correlated to individual numbers that we can track and hone in on over time. That is things like the opportunity close rate, or that is things like the lifetime value, or the expected likelihood to close positive won. All of these things are tools that really, when you get at full capacity, you should be able to be pumping out different scores that can improve your math overall. So the kind of core math philosophy is that we need really good math, and we need human supervision and interpretation and being driven by humans, as opposed to whatever the system spits out and whatever the out-of-the-box solution is. So pros to this. One, I think this is an enormous competitive advantage. Right now, the amount of companies who have data science run organizations within their marketing operations or their marketing departments is very low. And what we're seeing is our more advanced clients are getting enormous benefits from it. So I think that it has really the core onus is that we have scientific marketing. It's actually, numbers are based on reality, run by reality, and actually peer reviewable. You can stand extreme scrutiny into the actual scores and the arguments that you have for this score equals this because of these inputs or otherwise. And that scrutiny is massively important for being able to bring the success of marketing and the science of marketing throughout the rest of the organization. That's another goal that I think drives progress overall with this. The other pros that you get from this approach is you can use any math that you want. It's not locked into certain types of math that predictive vendors might be. So for example, if you want multilinear regressions and you have a data science team who is a big fan of this, then that is a model that you can employ. Or you can employ more neural networks, the competitive version of that, where we can do deep learning and basically have the machine learn and improve its quality of score over time. But the point is, there's so many advancements in data science right now that tools aren't keeping up, and the best way to bridge that gap is to have an actual human supervision to make sure that all of these things run smoothly. The cons, you have to bring your own infrastructure. That's a big one too. That means that you need not just your marketing and your CRM database or your data warehouse, but you also need to be able to take all of that, churn through the math, and then spit out individual numbers and summed up scores that can be synced to Marketo. Also, very tight talent market. I don't know if you shop for data scientists soon, they're expensive. And you need really quite a bit of organizational buy-in to even move toward this direction. It requires things like a large enough opportunity count and marketing operations throughput that optimizing is actually a good justification of, you can imagine, $250,000 investment of a person plus the technology that you need to actually make this happen. But if you can make that argument, if you have enough throughput where a small increase in conversion rate and from a sales pipeline can have a numerical measured revenue effect, then you're in the clear, and that is really the value of stage 3, is that we can run these and improve the system over time. So what we've found, the next question becomes, what is the actual, how many people are in each of these categories? How common is each one? And what I'm showing on the screen right now is based on about the 5 years of experience that we have being in just hundreds of different Marketo instances, seeing people over time, the different directions and maturities that they work within just of data science overall. And what I see is, generally 15% have stage 0, which is to say nothing. This is usually because they're not in a normal applicable B2B industry. So I wouldn't really shame them as much. Stage 1 is where we get directional math. I'd say about 60% of people who have Marketo right now are in this kind of world. It's where we have directional math, it's stage 1. Stage 2, predictive vendors. This is where we see, people who have large volume SaaS companies and big volume mid-market. That's where we see a lot of stage 2 actually come into play because there's a lot of numbers to play with. And then the most important, in my opinion, stage 3 is where we get an actual data science team for marketing operations. And when we have this team, we can do way more things. And it's a ginormous competitive advantage, as you can see, because that amount is so low overall in the actual maturity stages of marketing for these companies. And so what we have is the actual person, proportional headcount, anything else that you want to do, full-time person, all the way up to a fully staffed team of data science. And in this world, this is really where we can hit the ground running and have massive optimizations within marketing that are actually measured and actually have the case studies in them. And that's stage 3, and that's really where we see some of the larger improvements coming out of the industry at this point. Great, so now we're getting into the types of scoring. I have on the screen the most common types, and this is a moderately exhaustive list. You can see, for example, it might be missing something. I would probably add recency score into this. But there are lots of different ways that you can do these different types of targeting and things that they actually are doing. One of the differences that we see is the difference between what object actually within the system you're doing the scoring on. Most commonly, lead scoring is really what everyone does within Marketo, as in it's on the person object in Marketo, not the company, not the opportunity, nothing else like that, no custom objects. It's entirely just the person record information. And so that's where we get the top section. That's commonly behavioral and demographic. More in B2C, we get into psychographic, less applicable in this case. The second one is when we're talking about companies and actual firm scores. This is where we have account-based scores, which is the sum of engagement minutes, for example, in an Engagio world. Or we have other things such as company revenue, employee size, what industry they're in, lots of mix and matches. These happen on the account level, and technically it's hard to do, but that's one of the things that you can determine how many resources you want to put toward that initiative. And then the last one is kind of the combination of those two. This is, which is, say, person object plus company object is engagement minutes, fit score, intent score, as well as profile scores, which I think is a very valuable high maturity piece of profiles that we should be able to spin out, scores we should spin out to say, how lookalike is this person to a buyer persona, etc., things like that. This is a kind of a high level overview of it, and just a little reference slide for what you're looking at here. So, on to the next one here. All right, let's talk about really rubber hits the road, time to have some practical tips. This is where we actually get into this. Here's the meat of the whole presentation here. Let's talk about stage one, how you want to do stage one. Stage one, for a reminder, directional math. It's where we have behavior score, demographic score, other things like this. There are basically two categories of companies that I want to address with this one. One, we have you don't have enough information, so you come up with general estimates of what each individual weight should be. For example, how much is a web visit? How many points is that? How many points is an email click? Is an event attendance? Anything else like this that's in the kind of behavioral category, as well as demographic, which is instead looking at title, industry. It's a combination of firmographic, which is company demographics, as well as person demographics, things like title and role. And so what we do is basically, and this is what I recommend most people do, is if you don't have any actual scores and you don't have any data in the system, then just start with best practices. We have those on the next slide, and you can just straight up take them. In the case that you do have data in the system, this is really important. If you do have data in the system, you should be running and coming up with your weights based on the actual information of what's happening. And the way that you do that is a report or a collection of reports. Actually in Marketo, you can do this as people performance reports, grouped by individually the amount of interactions that they have. So for example, if somebody visits once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, to be able to categorize that. What I'm showing on screen here is the really basic, if you're gonna do the first stage, this is similar to how you should do it. You should come up with actual numbers based on your company, as opposed to applicable to anybody who might be a Marketo customer. So the way that I do that, I'm kind of showing you here, is I look at a success group and a failure group is really the two pieces that drive this. And what we're trying to do is to distinguish which features are more likely to represent success group versus which features mathematically are less likely to be showing up in a failure group. So you can see here, basically what I do is we go through and determine success groups for each one, and then we determine those failures, we group them, and then you can see the actual math. So for example, web visits here. We have a difference between 20 web visits in a success group versus 5 in a failure group. And we have to define that success, and it needs to be really objective and entirely measurable. So commonly what I do in this world for behavior, I like to say behavior is the likelihood of having a positive conversation with sales. And frequently that in our world means that somebody turns into an actual sales qualified lead or books a meeting. So either one of those defines a stage definition, something like a sales accepted lead, and then we look at the cohort of people who got into that versus the people who had enough time to get in there but didn't. And that's the two comparisons where we have success group versus failure group. And so we look at this and we determine that, for example, in web visits, there are way more web visits associated with a success group than a failure group. And of course, this is intuitive, and that's kind of the problem with the directional math here. But it should sum up to the point where you can determine your weights based on these reports. And it should just be formulaic, and you should improve these over time. But generally, remember, this is directional math. This doesn't represent necessarily a real math correlation between these values. That's what the next step is. So, with this, the first step, if you have data in your marketing automation system, then that means behavioral data as well as demographic information, as well as sales CRM information on closes and stages. You should use that information to actually influence the weights. In the case that you don't have any of that data, instead, just take these values. We've done this a lot. We're just giving away the values that we use as best practice for people who did not have anything in their instance. This is pretty common in terms of behavior score. Use these behavior score weights to come up with your own demographic weights. But this is an actual example. These are literally the tokens in our system, the literal values that drive all of the operations of these scores. Of course, smart campaigns link these up together and everything else like that. But most importantly, this is where the math resides. And if you don't have any data, just take this. This is best practices. This is as close as you can get without having any real data. It's directional. But additional effort beyond this, I would argue, is close to futile. Again, you don't have to worry about taking screenshots or anything like this. We have this actual list of our scores in the link that we're talking about, etu.dev/summit, as all of those there. So now we have stage 2 predictive vendors. There are lots of options. It's up to you to choose. Generally, what I recommend clients as they're figuring this out, if you want to ask me specifically who my favorite predictive vendors are, I can't really say that on camera, but what I do recommend is shortlisting down to 2 different vendors and then running a bake-off, which is to say you do a controlled test where we say, platform A is going to spit out a feed, and we're going to be able to see how much that correlates with real sales data that's close won, or we can run a pilot or a proof of concept and have a select amount of salespeople actually being run off of the predictive values as opposed to your previous methodology. I think getting it down to that bake-off is very important because vendors, it's not really a straight up and down, this vendor wins. It really depends on the business. There are lots of impacts. So for example, industry, company size, who your prospects are, who your ideal prospects are. For example, if you're selling to SMB, that's harder because there's less information that we can purchase about that in terms of data enrichment in order to get more intelligent math there. So I'd recommend get 2 vendors, do a bake-off, and then do an intelligent pilot program to make sure that we can say, yes, definitively, investing in predictive is going to increase our close rate and have a correlated increase of revenue of X thousands of dollars per quarter. Considerations that you have for the vendors, there are lots of options. Black box is certainly a consideration. A lot of vendors just hide everything and they don't tell you the formulas that they're using. That personally bothers me because I'm a data nerd, but if it doesn't matter, that's fine. Another consideration is enrichment. And if you want to combine the predictive analytics as well as the data points that they're using, and this is the kind of enrichment consideration. Regardless, they're similar-ish price, and it's worth having a conversation to determine which one you want to do if you're going down this route. Generally, I consider this as before you have a marketing operations person, and so it's kind of should be geared toward a kind of set it and forget it model that should be revised about, one every 6 months, one every year kind of thing. So that's the predictive vendors. I want to kind of skip by that because I think it's a pretty saturated market, and I think there's a lot of knowledge out there that you can research on your own. Stage 3, though, is really where it gets interesting. And let's jump into that. Stage 3 is about data science and bringing in data science. And this is kind of a dramatic idea, and it's been picked up a little bit, and we see some of our more advanced clients using it. Some of the larger enterprise companies that are really advanced in maturity for marketing operations and their marketing overall. But the recommendation here is that we have a data scientist under a team that I call the Marketing Intelligence Operations Team, or MIOps. And this team specifically is kind of a department within and under marketing operations that focuses on data quality, on making sure that we have a data warehouse that's maintained, and making sure that we have controlled tests that we can run to prove the efficacy of marketing, as well as the creation and management of individual scores, profile scores, as well as any other types of scores or categorization that can be really intelligence basis fed into Marketo to drive things like individual, company demographic scores, product scores, interaction with your different tools, everything else like that can be part of it. So the kind of three things that I consider to be the core fundamental responsibilities of the marketing MIOps person, as we call it, Marketing Intelligence Operations. It's like BI except for marketing is really the emphasis there, is increasing the data, amount of data, and the accuracy of the data within your data warehouse. This is one because we need to have more and more enrichment signals constantly. The more data that we have, the more intelligent we can be about the way that we process and then summarize and feed in that information into a marketing automation system or Salesforce or CRM. The second one that we have is creating and monitor scores. This is really the value of MIOps. This is when we can say, for example, tell me how similar to a C-level buyer persona this individual is based on their activity, as well as any other data signal that we have: demographic, firmographic, psychographic, behavioral, scraped intent data from other sources, many sources of how we can do this. And it becomes the MIOps function's job to take that data warehouse, summarize the information in it, and then on a person-to-person record, come up with a literal recommendation of, Edward Unthank, Unthank at Etumos.com has, the score for what I'm most likely to, actually pursue next in terms of channel. It can have channel affinity scores. We can talk about having what the next best recommended event is based on geography of an individual, as well as the types of assets that a person is engaged with over the past. We can do things like have deep learning machine and have an actual feedback loop to estimate the actual monthly spend if you're a SaaS product based on factors that we can control and measure. So as soon as, for example, the idea is as soon as somebody comes into your database, you can estimate what their expected spend would be and then redo your entire business, your priority of marketing and sales based on what is going to mathematically, in a mathematical expected value model, create the greatest amount of revenue for your organization. And then the last thing that the MIOps team is really key for is to be able to run and measure controlled tests of marketing and sales. This is important because you can do what I call random cohort assignment. I've written about this before. This is again in the links that you can hear some more about this. But basically what we do is we have the ability to put individuals in cohorts that will stay with them throughout their life in our marketing automation system. And by doing that, we can say, imagine people coming in the door, and we can say, you're group 1, you're group 2, you're group 3, you're group 4, you're group 5. And that number stays with them for life. And then we can create in the system itself actual controlled tests. So for example, if your number is number 1, then you shouldn't even be marketed to. We want to do a global holdout in the system to make sure that you're not added to nurture, so that we can, for example, measure how much nurture is increasing the conversion rate from marketing accepted to marketing qualified, and also the correlated revenue that's with that, the expected revenue from that stage. And so the data science team, the MIOps team, is really what takes all these pieces and deals with them in a long-term and scalable responsibility approach. And so these are the core responsibilities for a data scientist on the team. So I'm going to move into the next slide here. And so here's a real example, an actual custom score that a MIOps team gives you the ability to do where existing tools just can't do it. There's not enough data out there. One of those things is to estimate sales anchor price. This is to see different people in the database, which is to say different companies, have different perspectives about what they care when they're doing different buying decisions. And what we can do, and part of the problem and the core challenge of this, is be able to know, are you talking to somebody where you should recommend an anchor price of $5,000 per month or $20,000 per month? The difference between those is if you say 20 and this person can only afford 5, you halt the conversation. It's a bad anchor price, and it's too much of a leap to go down to another offering. Instead, what you can do is you can dynamically, with the actual combination of data you can scrape from the internet, and you can accrue, and you can use your product to collaborate and come up with a data warehouse for anything like this, we should be able to do correlations to come up with a suggestion of what a best anchor price could be, so that a salesperson starts with the best anchor price, which is to say the first number that you say in a sales conversation is what really stays in the memory. And then everything else is a comparison by percentage to that anchor price. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you set the anchor price as reasonably high as possible while still guaranteeing close rates. And the way that you can do this is by having your MyOps team say, estimate what our lookalike customers look like and determine what the proclivity and likeliness of being into group, mega enterprise sale approach versus mid-market versus startup. But the real value of what I'm talking about there is this classification of startup, mid-market, enterprise is the easiest to refer to, but is not the best correlation to what the best product match is going to be for the person. So you can use MyOps to be able to say and spit out a real literal value of a suggested anchor price that sales can use and marketing can use in order to increase the efficacy of the overall revenue engine. And then I want to get into the good quality stuff about doing marketing, new marketing and marketing smarter for people. And I want to talk about targeting and how profiling plays into targeting. I'm going to give you the example of product interest profiling. This is something that a lot of companies have problems with. You have multiple products, you have to determine what is the best fit product for someone, and how do we determine that systematically, and how do we determine if somebody has multiple interests, what do we do? Who do we choose? And how does this actually drive our marketing automation logic? And so what I've found is there are generally 3 types of targeting that can be included in this. You can see them on screen here. We have instant win, one-off values. This is something where, if you right now, for example, came and downloaded this resource, we would consider that your interest is in either, nitty-gritty intelligence on marketing intelligence operations, or somebody who's looking more at a team structure, how to build things out. And that would be our guess based on the target audience. But we would say, great, your product interest changes to X, and that stays forever. There are problems with that. It's one-off, and it's not very intelligent, just not very robust. Second is purchase demographics, actual field values, where you're doing things like, your title contains CEO or chief or executive, and your employee count also is greater than 500. And then we also have industry segmentation in order to guess from a top level down what somebody is actually interested in terms of the product. So those are the 2 really common kind of out-of-the-box ways that people deal with this. I'm going to talk to you about the third one, which is profiling programs based on marketing intelligence operations. And this is what I consider to be the core advantage, actual advantage in the amount of and quality of marketing that a person can do. This is where we determine things like product interest, or you can imagine it's also buyer stage, or it could also be persona type, anything else like this. These are all common versions where we can have a profile score that can measure affinity and match likelihood practically as a percentage up to 100% of interested in this product or other subtype. So profile scoring is really a good application of marketing intelligence operations, and it's quite a large competitive advantage because so few people are doing it well. When we talk about targeting generally, what we try to do is we try to get an idea of how people fit from our philosophical targeting and marketing into an actual system that can correlate and actually match those up. really frequently in marketing. I'm sure most people in this room have seen this. We have really well-developed targeting strategies. We come up with content matrices. We come up with mapping of buyer journeys, everything else like this. But if it's high level and doesn't correlate to marketing operations, actual system values that we can measure and improve upon, it's nearly not valuable. So what we need to do is to increase the targeting quality. If somebody cares about something, we need to communicate that to them as quickly as possible and not spam out many options. Generally, I find even is, the first 4 communications that you get to a prospect in the database are the only ones that count, really, because that's where you lose interest. In email marketing, we go into unsubscribes. So in order to do this, we need to maximize the targeting accuracy and value of our first 4 communications. And how you do that, you're going to do very common one-offs. They're on screen here. Instant win values, it's easy. It's a hacky approach. It works. The second one is you can have more static considerations like segmentations in your database themselves. I would say these are top-down and don't necessarily react or map perfectly to the reality of these things. So for example, if you're trying to determine product interest based on static fields, you have to do things like title contains chief, executive, CEO, and you have to do employee count is greater than 500 people as well. And then you have to also match up with industry. And a lot of these things are not actually correlated to what our marketing strategy is about. So we need to fix that and fix that gap. The way that we do that is with MyOps. And MyOps, the entire point is that we have a database that marketing intelligence operations, MyOps, data science people can actually do math off of and come up with other correlations such as the percentage match of likelihood to be product interested in product A, or what's that compared to the numerical value of product interest in product B, and what is the summed up value. And you can see on the slides that we have here. But profiling programs, this is really where you can see, you have kind of a diagram on screen. It's a proclivity and a likelihood to match these different types. And these are key. We can use these to have comparative values of product interest. So for example, we dynamically need to make sure that we're giving the most targeted information to a prospect in marketing. The way that we do that is we determine what is the highest value of the most like a product interest profile. And for example, we can see, if there's a goat versus a moose competition, that, the goat might have 76% likelihood to be interested in that product versus a moose product interest might be only, 24%. And that means comparing those numbers, a human would say greater number is the best, and therefore we should standardize on that. And you can do that with marketing intelligence operations, and that is massively valuable. It means that you can actually improve targeting over time in a measured way. And you can also see, and just to throw out another use case of how this is important, sales. Imagine CRM. You have multiple products. You have 4 or 5 different products or maybe product groups, and originally you might have a first product interest. So for example, if you're really interested in printers, but you're not interested in laptops, an HP might say that those are entirely different scores. And one score is probably, by most ways that companies build these, just one score is what ends up winning. And so a salesperson shouldn't just see that summed up piece, but can also be fed further intelligence about relative score numbers of interest. So for example, this is a common way that this breaks. If you have barely negligibly different interests between product A and product B, that looks exactly the same as having absolutely zero interest in product B. And that is where things kind of fall apart. And so I like, whenever we do this with our clients, I really like to give the individual values and talk about cross-sell and upsell opportunity. Because somebody may come in on product A, but they might also be interested in products C and D. And a salesperson should be able to see this and determine that there's cross-sell opportunity that can increase lifetime value quite significantly at the same time. So there are lots of ways that you can do this. There are lots and lots of opportunities for this and ways that this can improve. And basically the kind of approach that we take is we're trying to take all of the data that we can, as much data as possible, as close to 100% data as possible. And we want to take that, analyze it, group it, add production layer of analysis for marketing intelligence operations, and spit that out, the final summed value, into Marketo, as opposed to doing all the practical interpretation and math and processing in the Marketo side. You should do it. It's been massively valuable. I'll give you another example of one that we've done that's been a huge use of marketing intelligence operations, has been dynamic content recommendations fed by a centralized data warehouse that is the layer of intelligence in marketing intelligence operations. What we do and what you can do is you can have an entirely, you can have many different formulas and combined formulas, joins between, for example, accounts and contacts associated, or leads auto-converting to contacts mapped to fuzzy match to actual accounts. All of these things we can include when it might be very incredibly technical, hard to do that in Marketo itself. We can do that in an actual data warehouse, and we can spin up many different values. And the kind of the value of that too is when you get into the mega volume, the 1 million+ records in your database, active records in your database, then you really need to consider how do you scale the system itself, and that's really when we want to offboard and offload a bunch of that heavy processing that I would consider noisy. So some integration tips for how to actually do this. I would say some things that you need to do. When you're at scale volume, you need to think about how this data syncs from Marketo to your CRM, because that is a huge bottleneck. And so what you want to do, you don't want to actually feed off the individual scores. CRM doesn't care, and I don't really care if you have an increase from score of 12 to 13. That's useless to me. It has no actual real value. All I care about is the abstractions of those into the buckets that I care about. And the value of this is that we decrease the amount of field changes per person record that need to be synced over to the CRM. And that's how you do this at scale. You say, instead of an individual score, we want a grade abstraction, A, B, C, D. And then we sync over the A, B, C, D because that's what a salesperson actually uses, but we're not going to destroy our sync in the case that we need to update 100% of the database, and now we can't use our CRM integration for 2 weeks. The other thing that I've seen from this, one of the best ways to use scoring that we've been using quite a bit, is to be able to have scores to have distinguished priority levels of human resources assigned to individuals. This means that we can use predictive scoring or our MyOps model and take any A or B leads, cherry pick them off top, and send them over to an AE, an actual senior salesperson, versus C and D leads, and maybe even F leads. These individuals are considered low grade, but importantly, the low grade isn't to say we need to throw them in the trash. It's to say that we're probably going to have lower annual contract value and lifetime value from these persons, expected rather, and we need to make sure that those persons are also followed up in. But that's where we get into automation. Basically say, the higher the score, the more human touch from sales and marketing, even if you're doing an ABM play. And then anything below that turns into more automation, as opposed to we're just going to forget about C, D, and F leads. You should do something with them, but it should probably be a backup where you're expecting lower conversion rates from them and giving them an opportunity to self-service into revenue as quickly as they can, or as fully as they can without needing human touch. And then the last one here is we should be having and thinking about how to roll this out really thoughtfully. And that's actually a great transition into the next slide here. Okay, so rollout and change management. We talked about all these things. Technically, I'm hoping that was valuable too for everyone. But we need to talk about how do you actually do these. It's one thing to make amazing math and put it into a system. It's another thing for people to understand it and to use it. And in that case, what we need to look at is, the real world. I'd like to say, and I have it on the screen here, in an ideal world, you turn it on, it works, sales loves it, marketing uses it, it's auto-updated in every report everywhere, in lifecycle processing, and it all works. Never works. Real world. Real world is kind of in the small organizations, or the small to mid, where you have, I'd say less friction for change management. And in this world, you can I would recommend a small world, get an individual plant in your sales department who can be your friend and your best friend. And then you need to train your team, you need to measure the successes, and then you also, I find really quite a bit of value if you're implementing behavior score for the first time to a sales team or a new score type or profile score. You need to, measure the efficacy of that, as well as shouting successes to the team. It's really important to get buy-in, because basically, with a whole team, some team of salespeople, AEs, XDRs, everyone gets busy in the way that they do things, and some people are early adopters, some people are not. And so you want to identify early adopter, get buy-in from early adopter, and then shout the successes from that early adoption so that you can convince the rest of the sales org to also follow suit and stack and change their organization of their sales process around these numbers. And then we have the political world, the enterprise world. This is, in reality, when you have a large organization, you have large sales teams, distributed sales teams, you have distributed marketing automation, marketing operations, you have to be way smarter about how you do this. It's really easy to make enemies by mandating changes to a team that is not your own team, that can be onerous and manual, and sometimes risky. You're risking somebody's actual check, an actual compensation check for sales based on the trusting this number. So you have to win their trust from that. The way that I found this to be the most effective in an enterprise world for doing large change management, if you're doing steps, I have them on screen here. 1, pilot. You need a pilot program with the sales team or the SDR team. You need to take, if they have 100 sales people and that's divided into 5 different groups, what you want to do is you want to get one of those groups and take and cherry pick. I like to cherry pick the loudest, most opinionated people in the sales organization, the ones that are actual leaders and people respect their opinions, and we get them involved in this process. We convince them. We run and design the scores with actual back and forth and conversation and analysis with sales. And what we do is you create champions out of that pilot group. And you say, for example, this pilot group is running off of our intelligence, marketing intelligence of scores, and compare that to this other one, which is using old school behavior score. And we as the marketing operations team designs that test and the infrastructure of that, and we can measure what, for example, the meeting set rate would be with model new scoring versus model old finger in the wind directional scoring. And to be able to measure the difference in meeting set rate between those two cohorts, you can say, great, this cohort of pilot champion group is more effective by this number, therefore we're going to roll it out to everyone. 1 gives you a case, business case and numbers, and also importantly, it allows the proof to be distributed and consolidated before spreading it to the rest of the team. And some tactile things about that change management plan. You need to have high-level buy-in from people's actual managers or directors. And so what we do is we kind of ghostwrite some communication changes from that person, schedule that out, and then have facilitated office hours, training, and an onboarding schedule. Things like recorded video training, we have a soft launch, we have open office hours for questions. That's super helpful, where your actual marketing operation says, every day from 9 to 10 a.m. In our time zone, we'll be just in this meeting room. You can join us and ask any questions. We'll help walk you through, any salesperson will walk you through the process, what it means, everything else like that. And then we get final change management, and then we get final hard launch. And this I found has been a pretty effective way at getting buy-in pretty quickly. You can run all of this as a stream in tandem with some of the development of these scores, and you can roll them out at the same time. So that's kind of what we got. We got the summary all there, and if you need any of the resources, you should check them out. It's etu.dev/summit on screen on the slides. And if you have any other questions or you want to nerd out about these conversations, talk about building these, anything else like that, get secret evaluations of vendors, just drop me a line and I'd be glad to talk through anything that you have to ask.